We're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the subjunctive mood. So the subjunctive mood is new for us. All the verbs that you've been working with up until today are in the indicative mood. We're now going to start talking about using verbs in the second mood called subjunctive. So this presentation is only to talk about formation. We're not going to talk about using subjunctive mood yet. How do we form it? Well, we'll talk about an example verb, an AR, ER, and IR verb, because for second and third conjugation. And we'll use these three patterns because these are easy verbs to remember, and they're always regular. To form a verb in subjunctive, you would start with the yo form. You'd cross off the O, and that becomes your pattern, your stem. So to form an AR verb in subjunctive mood, a verb like hablar, I will find my stem and then put on what's called the opposite vowel endings. So because this is an AR verb, the opposite vowel endings will be E's. And when I conjugate this verb through the subjunctive, I end up with hable, hables, hable, hablemos, hables, and hablen. If I conjugate a second or a third conjugation verb, like comer or vivir, these are both going to work the same way. I still will start with the yo form. So if I start with como, get rid of the O. The part that's left is called the stem. And to the stem, I'm going to put on, again, what we call the opposite vowel endings. So opposite vowel for an ER or an IR conjugation verb will be A. That means the forms in the subjunctive, goma, gomas, goma, gomamos, gomais, and goman. Okay, so far, nothing tricky. Let's talk about what if a verb like the verb tener is irregular in the yo form. So if I begin with this yo form, cross off the O, this is going to be a little bit different from what we've done in the indicative mood. This stem is actually going to carry all the way through the forms in the subjunctive. So there's no IE stem changing any longer. We're just using the yo form stem. And to this, we'll add the opposite vowel endings. So since this is a ER verb, I'm going to put A's into my endings. I end up with tenga, tengas, tenga, tengamos, tengais, and tengan. Okay, so that's pretty different from what we've done before, carrying the yo form stem all the way through. Another slightly irregular problem we could have with verbs would be working with a verb that's stem changing. So if we use the verb sentar, for example, and sentar is an IE stem changer, we'll start with the yo form, cross off the O, so far that's the same thing we've said. And now what we learned about conjugating stem changing verbs is still true in that you're going to have the change in all forms except nosotros and vosotros. So in other words, remember we called these shoe verbs? That is still going to be our pattern. This is an AR verb, so I'm going to go back through and put on the opposite vowel endings, and in the subjunctive mood, I'll end up with siente, sientes, siente, sentemos, sentes, and sienten. And again, you can see what happened. It stem changed in the shoe. So shoe verbs are still shoe verbs, as long as they're AR or ER conjugation. On the next slide, we'll talk about what happens if it's an IR conjugation. The verb dormir is one that you've used before. It's kind of an easy one to remember. It's a UE stem change verb. It is an IR verb. So when I work with yo form, cross off the O, still a rule. Stem changing verbs in the third conjugation kind of break the rule a little bit. This happened with the IR stem changers before. Remember in the preterite? Instead of having a UE in the nosotros, we end up with the D-U-R-M stem, and that's going to happen in vosotros also, okay? And now if I go through and put on my opposite vowel endings, since this is an IR verb, I'll put on A endings in a pattern. Us, amos, ice, and un. A-I-S accent. And remember we used to call these ski verbs in the preterite? So that's your reminder, those verbs that were IR stem changers in preterite tense, well, they're still, causing a little trouble for us in the subjunctive mood. Okay, there's one last thing to talk about. So on the next slide, I'll talk just about what happens if you're working with a verb like, ser, that doesn't have an O to cross off. Well, if there's no O to cross off, then clearly that's got to be an irregular. So you'll have a short list of irregulars. We'll talk about those when you get to class. Okay, so hopefully just have the idea with you that you start with the yo form of the verb, work with those opposite vowel endings. If it's a stem changing verb, still stem change. Unless it's an IR, then, you're stem changing, but also in nosotros. Okay, so hasta mañana. Ciao.